2 residential treatment listening sessions. First, let me start off by thanking you for joining us. I know that it's not easy to carve time out of your day, and so I just want to let you know that we appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences with us. So thank you very much for doing that. Before we get started, I do want to take a few moments to orient everyone to the WebEx system. If you have not done so already, please take a moment to call into the webinar using the audio conference information found in the Event Info tab above the slide deck. This will allow you to participate in the discussion portion of the webinar. As the webinar is intended to solicit your feedback around your experiences, we're hoping that you're able to join us via the phone call instead of your computer. When you are on your computer, you would be unable to have a conversation and participate in that portion of the webinar. Once on the call, you will be unmuted, so we ask that when you are not speaking to please mute your phone to avoid any feedback or background noise. And we also request that please do not place us on hold, or we will end up hearing your lovely background music. So thank you for taking that into consideration. If at any time during the webinar you come across any technical issues, please chat to Brianna, the host, and she shall be able to assist you with any issues that you're having. And you can find the chat box on the right side of your screen where you're able to chat to Brianna. All right, so I want to take a moment just to introduce myself. My name is Yvette Kelly, and I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, which provides training, consultation, and support for an array of children's mental health programs, to include beginning to provide more specialized offerings for RTF. I'm also joined by some of my colleagues, Jason Jones and Ann Colpinshire, who will be assisting us with some of the technical aspects of the webinar and will also help guide us through some of the discussion questions. So just so I get a sense of who is on the line, we're going to ask that you take a minute to complete the poll question that is now up and let us know what is your role in the agency. So if you could just take a few minutes, we'd always like to know who has joined our webinar. So you could just let us know what your role is, and it usually just takes a few minutes for us to get the results in. I appreciate it. All right, the poll has ended. Results should be coming up soon. So who has joined us today? It looks like there are a number of you who are directors or administrators, and as well as some other individuals in the residential treatment facilities. And so once again, let me just thank you for joining us and being able to share your knowledge and experiences. I want to take a few minutes just to go over and review the agenda for the day and just kind of talk about the purpose of the listening sessions, the role of the Community Technical Assistance Center, an overview of the current system changes, competencies, and questions. So we will, again, just to kind of review, what is our purpose today of the listening session? So I would like to start the conversation by acknowledging that our sector is undergoing a significant shift in how we work with children and families. And given this, the landscape for how residential services are delivered is rapidly changing. We as providers are going to be asked to stretch ourselves beyond traditional service delivery models to meet the needs of children and families. And so given this, the workforce will need to develop new competencies for working with children and families, and providers will need a plan to adapt to these changes. All right, the competencies the workforce will need to incorporate is really to develop and enhance their competencies to be more family and community focused. And again, providers will need to develop a plan to address this. And so the role of CTAC is to assist providers in their efforts to adopt best practice approaches. And in order for us to ensure that our offerings align with the needs of providers, CTAC needs to understand what are some of the challenges working in residential and what are some of your perceived needs in terms of being able to adopt some of these best practice approaches. And so from our standpoint, we need to refine our understanding around what are some of the engagement practices that you are using in the residential facilities? What are some of the clinical practices and how effective and efficient do you find them to be? What are some of your reality-based challenges? What are those things that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis that perhaps you need some extra support around? And again, what are your training and resource needs? Both, again, to learn how to adopt and implement best practices into your program. I think we have to understand that the rules have changed, that residential treatment providers have been called upon to make a transformational change. And what I mean by a transformational change is that it actually requires a shift in the culture and values that have historically underpinned residential treatment. So the shift requires that we learn how to work with children and families differently. And so as providers, that is what we're challenged with. And so we asked ourselves, what is really behind all of this change? What's driving this change? Some will say that it's, that it's managed care, it's money that's driving the change. But the reality of that is that the change we are experiencing as a sector is not about money, but about a dramatic shift in perspectives and priorities for children and families, and the redirection of those funds to reflect these changing priorities. So I know that a lot of this transformational process comes into play when we're talking about the state transitioning into managed care, but I don't want to lose sight of that this is not about money. This is about understanding that there are better ways to work with families to get more durable outcomes. And I think too often we lose sight of that, so I think it's important to note that. And what is it around this sense of urgency? Why is there such a sense of urgency to transform? Well, we know that nationally as well as statewide, residential services are being challenged to employ evidence-based practice models to achieve better outcomes for children and families. We know that we're being asked to shift from a long-standing child-centered perspective to a more family and community focus. And we are being asked to serve children in much shorter time periods. So not only do we want to ensure that we are providing quality services, but that we're doing it in the most efficient and effective manner possible. And so here's another poll question for folks on the line. Just tell me, what do you think is the average length of stay for children in residential care in New York State? Right, take a few minutes, and if you could answer the poll question. What do you think is the average length of stay for children in residential care in New York State? A few more minutes before the poll closes. Just a few more minutes and we'll pull up the results. All right, so most of you answered that it's 365 days, and the correct answer is about 500 days. All right, so that's important to know as we think about shifting our services to make sure that we are meeting the needs of kids, but in a relatively much shorter time. So we know that kids in New York State spend about an average of 500 days before they are discharged. And so I think it's important to note that we're really going to have to work to shorten that, and not for lack of quality either. So the intent is to provide quality, but really to work with children and families in their communities to get them out of residential care sooner. And so I want to talk a few minutes just to review some of the service trends. We know that there's less money from local, state, and federal governments. And we also know that, and this is relevant again in New York State, that service purchasers, managed care organizations, regulators increasingly want to buy results and not services. And that really is a bit of a shift from before. Before you buy a service, you buy so many of the service, but really what they want is the result at the end. There's a push to redesign existing services to ensure more durable results that can be sustained post-discharge. So we need to think beyond the doors of the residential treatment facility. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir, I know a lot of you know this, but we really want those gains that they learn in the facilities to really extend in home and community. And that's why there's such a significant push for providing these services more in home and community-based arenas. Engagement is going to be such a key factor in really working with families. And engagement is seen as the means to family stability. All right, so it's the method by which you help families resolve some of their issues and work to make changes so that they are able to be successful in the community. And so we really, I think as a workforce, are going to have to really think about how do we work with families, how do we engage families, and how do we do that ongoing, right? So not just at the initial meeting, but ongoing. And the emphasis is always on meeting safety and security needs as well as clinical needs. The emphasis, like I had mentioned, is going to be on community-based service delivery, so providing more supports in the community, doing that sooner so that children can transition home. Out-of-home care is going to be primarily utilized for crisis stabilization and preferably shorter lengths of stay. And so they're moving away from having kids in care in excess of 365 days. And the important in that is that there's going to need to be connection to existing community resources, leveraging these resources to help families maintain stability and allow children to grow and develop in healthy ways. And our role as providers as well is going to be focused on helping build natural support networks for families, right? So we can't be the provider providing all of that service and doing all of that work without bringing others into the network to really support and help the family. And care coordination and continuity of care is going to be seen as essential services, right? So how do we package the services in a way that it meets the family needs and is timely in doing so? But we also know this. We also know that there will continue to be a need for out-of-home care, right? So the thought is not that residential treatment facilities will not exist. That is not the thought, because we know that there will continue to be a need. And we know that when leveraged appropriately, residential services are an essential piece in the continuum of care. Our challenge is to figure out how to make them quality residential services, where we are connecting with families, connecting with communities, and being able to transition children out of care sooner to stable families. So that's going to be our challenge. So if you could take a few minutes, another poll question, and just talk about what is the single most challenging issue in working with children in residential care for you and your colleagues. Just to take a few minutes and answer that question. So what is the single most challenging issue in working with children in residential care? Right. Is it the trauma? Is it family factors, organizational structure, social impairment, or anything else? And again, this is to help us understand what are you guys dealing with on a daily basis? What are some of those reality-based challenges? You know, are there populations that you're finding that becomes more challenging to work with the current skill set? So if you could just take a moment and answer that polling question. And I also want to invite folks to, if you have a comment that you'd like to chat in or that you'd like to speak up, please feel free to do so. I just want to remind folks that this really is about learning about how CTAC can best help and support you and the work that you do. And I also don't want to lose sight. If you feel you do something well in your residential treatment facility and you'd like to share that with others, we'd love to hear that as well. All right, so it seems that most feel that the family factors are significant. It's almost a close tie. It's significant trauma and family factors really are challenging, the single most challenging things in working, issues in working with children. That's important to know. And so later we'll talk about how we might support the learning and the skills development that folks might think is necessary in order to better position ourselves to work with these challenging populations. So I just want to take a moment and ask, were there any thoughts? Would anyone like to contribute anything? And also just check in with Jason to see if there's any questions that have come in. So any comments? Any thoughts around just the service trends, what we know about residential care, what we know about all of the changes in our sector?
No, but there are no questions yet. I think it's okay to go on.
Okay. All right, so we'll keep moving, and there will be some other opportunities as well. So when we talk about what does quality care look like? What are some of those key competencies that we're going to need in order to improve our service, improve service delivery, work with children and families, get them out quicker, do it in the most efficient and effective way? There are some really big ones that kind of stand out. And I've mentioned them, but I really just want to take a moment to go through some of the tenets of them and what it is that we expect will be the need moving forward. And so we talk about family-driven core competencies. So what does this mean for the workforce? Again, the workforce is going to need to engage families and support them on a pathway to permanency and well-being. And they're going to need to ensure that families are involved in treatment and discharge planning from day one. That providers understand their needs and are working from the needs of the family versus, and all well-intentioned, but versus what they feel is the need for the family. And that families are respected and encouraged to jointly own solutions. And I also want to say this about doing family work, and I'm going to move on to, this is a diagram, a pictorial of what I think about working with families and what are the competencies and what are you going to need. And so I think it's important to know that when we're talking about working with families, we're talking about having a shared vision, mission, power, and resources. And so there's this collaboration where there's really, you're not above the family or the family is not, that there's some shared responsibility in that goal. And we all bring a piece of that to the table to help the family. So we're talking about working with families, working collaboratively with families. We know that we need to respect our families. We need to offer them choices. We need to be empathetic. We need to communicate what it is that we think they need to work on and have some conversations about that, what their options are. And we need to really position ourselves to be collaborative and solution finding with families. And so we really need to encourage them to come to the table. Now, understand that sometimes families are not used to this way of operating, and sometimes they may sit back, but we really need to empower and encourage them to be an active piece in the treatment planning for their family, and for them to share their thoughts about what's working, what's not working, what they did, for us to listen. What are some of the community supports that you can tap into? What are some of the natural supports? So really looking like that. It does take, it's relationship building, right? And we have to be open to really working collaboratively with families. And so we have another poll question, because this is one of the areas that we always want to look at, is how do we engage families? But what do you feel are the biggest obstacles in being able to work collaboratively with families? So if you could just take a moment and answer this poll question. What do you think are some of the biggest obstacles in being able to work collaboratively with families? Do you find that it's the distance, the location that families are from the facility? Is it a safety factor? What about time or priorities or any other issue that you feel really hinders your ability to work collaboratively with families? A few more minutes, look at the results from the poll. And this is an area that I'm going to ask that if you have put other, or you've identified some other issue that wasn't noted on here, we'd love to hear from you what that is, so we can understand what are some of the challenges that you're facing. So there are some others. Some say location and distance. So if you don't mind, I want to take a minute, open up the lines, and just ask folks, what are some of those other challenges?
I mean, multi-generational trauma in the past families move through their fear.
So I hear multi-generational trauma.
Are we muted? Hello?
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 Yes.
I had mentioned multi-generational trauma, which impacts our ability to move through the fears around reunification.
Okay.
And
So that impacts.
And community-based isolation.
I'm sorry, community-based?
Isolation.
Isolation, okay.
Community.
All right, so we have multi-generational trauma, the impact that has on just being able to work collaboratively with families, the remote locations. Anyone else? Anyone else would like to share what they feel are some of the biggest obstacles in being able to work collaboratively with families?
I'd say families' lack of resources. I think that a lot of these families that get to need residential care for their children have so many needs. And I just think the system fails in finding ways to be able to address those needs. Okay.
So you find that if there were some preventative measures that really address some of those early issues that it may not have led to them being where they are.
Absolutely.
Okay. How about others? What are some of the biggest obstacles and challenges? Jason, I'm going to go to you. Are there any things coming in?
Yeah, actually, one of the participants actually noted that the willingness of the RTAC staff to really venture off the campus, seeing this as a crucial piece of work, and the willingness to go the extra mile to meet families where they are.
Yeah, so I hear that a lot in my conversations with residential providers, just, and that is that culture shift that I was talking about in the beginning, is that really thinking about how we're going to do business differently. I know people are generally, they get comfortable, they're familiar with their role on the campus, or, they feel more safe on the campus and really are kind of, are struggling with being able to go out in the communities and connect with families. But as I mentioned before, that is really going to be kind of like the standard. And so we're going to have to learn how to help the workforce in making that shift, to moving from providing the services in this facility to actually moving the service to families. And some of the other challenges that you guys spoke of around like location and being able to connect with families. So if we're able to kind of move this service to them, that really helps us in mitigating some of those barriers. Any others?
I think one of the things we're finding is we are trying to make that shift. The intensity of clinical need within the residential milieu, coupled with the intensity of family need in the community, really puts a lot of compression on the clinical physicians, and it is a challenge to meet those levels of need with the numbers of workers that we have in the way that we would like to. So it's an ongoing challenge to look at how to use all resources effectively, but it is a lot of compression, and it's challenging, very challenging. Right.
And so what you're talking about is just there's a particular staff ratio that you need to have in the residential facility. And so go ahead.
As you move into more family-based work, and the need within the milieu for clinical expertise doesn't go down. If anything, it remains as equal or higher than it has been for 30 years. So, those people have an expectation to be present within the milieu as a resource, to be helpful for the skill building and the development of creating a milieu, and at the same time doing very intense work, 3.5 hours away for a family in the community. So managing those needs, within a 40-hour work week is relatively impossible. So that's something to think for the future.
And that's I appreciate that. That's very helpful, and that's a very reality-based challenge. So like trying to figure out how you're going to leverage and use your resources most efficiently and effectively to meet some of these best practice standards. And hopefully, as we provide more specialized offerings for residential treatment providers, we'll talk a little bit more about that and maybe identify some strategies that might be helpful. Others, Jason? Do you have 2 comments coming in?
Right. So we actually have a few. One that came in was that providers may not be aware of resources that are available in the family's community.
Oh, yes. That's a great point. And again, we are going to have to move as a sector to being more community-based, and so it really is finding what are those supports that are out there. Who can we connect families with? And and through my work of working with families, I found sometimes that they were the best folks to let me know the pace, the pulse in the community and telling me where things were. But it really does require, I think, from a workforce standpoint, to really kind of go out there and look and ask and find those community connections. So it can be very timely in trying to connect with the right services. But keep in mind that there are a variety of service providers who, I say we're all in this ballgame together, who you can tap into to say, are you familiar with a resource that will help me help my family? And as you do that through your work, through talking with families, your resources get bigger and bigger from that. But that's great. So providers are going to need to know, how do you find those resources in the community? How do you connect them to families? And that's going to be very important.
Great. And the last comment that came in was actually there seems to be an increased knowledge of services that remain untapped beyond mental health services that can engage youth and families.
I'm sorry, Jason. Can you just repeat that for me?
Sure. There seems to be an increased knowledge of services that remains untapped beyond mental health services that can engage youth and families.
Yeah. So, right. So increased knowledge of services that remain untapped beyond mental health services that can engage youth and families. That's absolutely right. And I want to encourage people to think outside of the box when it comes to how do you engage families? How do you provide the resource? Sometimes the resource is not necessarily a professional resource. Sometimes the resource is connecting a family or kid to an outside recreational event, right? Sometimes the resource is getting that kid on a baseball team or getting that kid on a basketball team. And so we really have to think creatively about what are we considering a resource, and how are we connecting our families to those resources. All good points. And that we really just had a great conversation regarding that. And so I also want to talk about some of these core competencies, and in particular, one of the biggest ones that I know everyone is aware of and hears it, but it's trauma-informed competencies, right? And so what does that mean as a provider? We're going to need to address child and family trauma through full organization and adoption and integration of trauma-informed work. That means creating a trauma-sensitive environment, and that ensures that we don't re-traumatize or exacerbate the symptoms of trauma. And professionals are going to need to understand the impact that trauma can have on the development of children and the difficulties and challenges with families. But I also want to take this one step further, just through a lot of work that we've done, that we also find that sometimes you have staff who have undergone significant trauma. And so you're thinking about how do you create this trauma-sensitive climate, and I want to urge folks to not forget about staff. Sometimes we have staff coming in who have undergone significant traumas themselves, and we're expecting them to work with kids who have significant traumas. And so we really need to be thinking about the whole picture here, right, in terms of this. How do we work with families better? How do we not re-traumatize them? How do we have empathy and understanding around some of those struggles? And as people mentioned before, multi-generations of trauma. So we have children and families who have just been, it's been generational in terms of some of the trauma that they've experienced. And so we want to keep that in mind in terms of when we're thinking about how are we going to create our environment so that we are trauma sensitive, right? Not only to our kids and families, but also to our staff, and understanding that that's important. We talked a little bit about this, but I do want to emphasize it a little more. We have home and community-based competencies, and again, I'm appreciative that you spoke up about some of the struggles around actually either having staff get comfortable with going out into the community or really just having the ability to do that. And we know that that gets tricky in residential treatment as you have to make sure that you continue to meet those staff ratios. But we need to construct an environment which the core work we do with children and families are in their homes and communities, right? And then we want to assist families in forming connections with their communities and facilitate the building of natural support. And again, I always want to say that natural supports come in a variety of different boxes, right? And so, as I mentioned before, thinking creatively about what services a family might need, it's kind of that same thing. Are there people in the community, whether it be, someone from the spiritual side or just a good family friend or someone who's really committed and concerned about that family that we can connect to? And that we can bring into our planning around the family and help them out. And I think it's just so important to keep that in mind because our ultimate goal is to have permanency for these children. And so we talk about community services and we talk about the need to be out in the community, but I also know through the experience that sometimes that's easier said than done, and that sometimes there are a lack of community support that helps transition children and families from residential care back to the community. So we're interested in hearing a little bit more about your perspective on what are some of the services that you feel your community is in need of to be more supportive to children and families, to be able to transition them out of care in shorter periods of time. What type of services are often lacking that you feel you're struggling with trying to piece together a plan for families? So if you could just spend a few minutes and answer the poll question. And again, if you put other down, we definitely want to hear what the other is, just so we can be informed. So if you just take a few minutes. And Jason, while we're waiting for the poll, were there any other comments or questions that have come in?
None yet.
Okay, thank you. So what are those services that you feel are lacking in the community that or that we need more of? So there may be some, but the capacity is not there. And so we would, benefit from having more of this service. Take a few moments and answer that question. And we'll get the results out. And again, if you chose other, we're so interested in hearing about what those other things might be, just so again we remain informed around what do you feel are some of those services that are really imperative to getting children out of care earlier. All right, so some say peer services, crisis services. There's really something in most of the categories. So if anyone be willing to talk a little bit about what they are seeing as a need in the community? Anyone interested in talking about what are some of the services that they feel they need to be more supportive to children and families?
I think truly good family therapy is lacking, at least in my region, in outpatient settings and in residential programs.
Okay, so a true family therapy focus. And again, we've heard that before, so that, we've heard that having true family, like you said, whether it's in the residence or in outpatient. How about others?
I would echo that same thing, particularly people who have a level of skill in understanding the themes of attachment and trauma.
Okay.
In terms of family work. And I also think that the clinic model limits the flexibility of that work happening in the home.
Oh, yes, okay. Are there any programs who have utilized either FFT or MFT, any programs that utilize that in their facilities or to transition children home? How about any?
We've done, we do have family therapists on in our clinical team, and we have done some exploration recently of shorter-term evidence-based family therapy models. We're actually looking at one where we have a conference call coming up with a developer. It's attachment-based family therapy.
Okay.
And we're taking a look at that, seeing if there's a way that we can speed up our process. We're finding we're getting some good traction with the family work that we're doing, but to enable us to get consistency with a shorter 6 to 9 month length of stay, we'd like to find a way to speed it up a bit. Okay,
great, Bruce. Thanks for sharing. So family work is one of those things. Any others that folks think is like it's a big need in order to support families in the community? Yeah, we hear a lot about needing family services, and again, some of the services are restrictive in nature in terms of you know, how you're able to deliver that. So, but they are becoming, as I think, as we transition into some of the managed care and there's new services on tap, I think there's more opportunities to provide these services with less restrictions in terms of that. So that's important to note. So I just want to share some closing thoughts around what we as a field need to prepare ourselves for. We know that, you know, the healthcare landscape is changing very rapidly, and sometimes it could be exhausting keeping up with all of the changes. And I think from a residential standpoint, we will, and other community and other child-serving agencies, is that we need to wrestle with the fact that our long-standing child-centered priorities, principles, and practices are going to be replaced with more family-focused set of priorities, principles, and practices. And so we will need to rethink our view of the family, but not just our view of the family. We will need to rethink how we work with families. And I think that's so critical and important. And I think as we begin this journey, that it might be a bit challenging as we're working through some of the old system stuff. And as some of you have mentioned, that making that transition is not, it's not always that easy, and it actually takes time. And so, again, the purpose of this is to really think about what are some of those things that we need to retool as a field so that we are prepared and are able to transition over some time to adopting more of these best practice models. And so I think that's an important piece to understand. And again, the purpose of the listening session is really to gather your feedback around, you know, what do you think the needs are, how we can best help you to be prepared for that transition and be able to adopt those best practices. We also know that how residential providers choose to transform and adapt to these changes will shape the future sustainability of residential treatment. So I think it's important to know that, again, as I mentioned, the landscape has changed, is in the process of changing, and that we really have to sometimes abandon some of those older ways of how we have responded and addressed families to more functional ways and ways that we're going to see more durable results and durable, long-lasting results. And so, you know, we're going to be challenged with being mobilized to do that and find ways in which we can. And I think it's a great time where there's, you know, it's a great time of opportunity to really think about how we could be creative in meeting a lot of those needs. All right. So before I move on, Jason, I just want to check in with you to see if there's any questions that have come in or any comments.
No, not at this time.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll move on to the next. So here's another poll question. Again, it kind of really sums up what we've been talking about, but really, what do you feel are the most needed in this current environment? What are some of those supports that you feel are most needed? And if you could just take a moment to complete that poll. So do you think it's training around foundational competencies, so family-focused, trauma-informed, home and community-based services, some of those foundational components? How do you engage families? How do you work collaboratively with families? Or do you think it's more specialty training, like working with a particular subset of youth, you know, some attachment issues, some fire setting youth, or is it staffing and personnel? What is it? We really need to improve upon our workforce, and we need to do that. So, and also a piece of that is quality supervision. You know, do you feel that you have the level of supervision needed to provide the services at a level that really speaks to quality? And I know that time is really scarce, and so, you know, is it a time factor, or is there something else that really impedes the ability to do this well? So if you could just take a few moments. really interested in hearing about what are some of those challenges, what are some of those struggles. A few more minutes. So what are some of the support that you feel? Okay. So most of you feel like there's some specialty training needed, there's some personnel issues, supervision is a small piece, and then there's some of you that weren't quite sure what you needed. Anyone willing to talk a little bit about what they feel their needs are? Anyone willing just to have a conversation about needs in the residential facilities? No? All right. So I'm going to move on. And so this really is just a poll question to work on, but also to understand that, you know, we are asking providers to do a lot in terms of just, I mean, there's just change after change after change. You know, we recognize that it can be exhausting. There's a lot of work going on in the state around readiness and preparing for managed care and doing all of those things. There's a lot of information coming in at you, and residential facilities in particular, you're still charged with taking care of those kids. You still have those kids every day, and you still have to do that. So I just really wanted a good pulse on kind of how do you feel that your facility is adapting to all of the changes. Are you a facility where you feel like, yeah, we got this under control, like we've been down this road for a while, we know that we needed to make the transition, or I'm exhausted, I'm out of here, I'm going to find a new line of work. Or if you're like up for the challenge, like better get my beauty sleep, right, because there's a lot of work to do. Or if you're just confused in terms of all the information coming at you, it's more like, what day is it again? So just take a few minutes and answer the poll question around, look, how do you think you're prepared for all of the changes that are on tap for the child behavioral health world? Take a few moments. And also I want to encourage, if you have thoughts after this webinar and you'd like to share them, please send them to us. As I mentioned before, we really are interested in your feedback around what you think your needs are, what you think will be helpful, you know, how we can best position trainings and offerings to suit your needs for you and your workforce. So, again, if you have a thought after this webinar, please feel free to send those, and my contact information will be below. I also want to mention that we will have one of the first in our series of offerings for residential treatment facilities, a webinar that's hosted by Beth Caldwell from the Building Bridges Initiative, along with some of the big names in family-driven care. And she will be hosting a webinar July 10th, and we're going to encourage everyone to sign into that. I believe that there's an announcement that has gone out. And so she's going to start talking around some of these conceptual things that we've talked about, but really how to put it into action. And so we're hoping that folks will be able to join us. And we're going to open it up to the general community, but really it's focused for residential treatment providers. So please check our website if you did not receive that. All right, so I got the poll question in, and it looks like there are a few who think they have it under control, and I'm so pleased to hear that. And then there's others who are up for the challenge, said they better get their beauty sleep because, you know, they know that there's a lot of work to be done. And there are some who say, you know, what day is it again? There's a lot of information. But I'm impressed that there are no ones that say I'm out of here. So that's really exciting for us because we're going to need all the support and help to provide services for children and families. So that's great. Before we close out for the day, though, I do want to give another opportunity for folks to comment around any of the stuff that they've heard in the webinar today, or if they have a thought on their mind. Jason, again, I'm going to check back in with you to see if there's any questions. But please, if you have moments before we close out the webinar.
No, there's nothing at this time, but I do encourage everyone to please submit your questions if you do have any.
Yeah, we really want to hear from you, and there will be other avenues as well. But again, you know, we really want to speak to what your needs are. So if there's something that you think of after the webinar, please feel free to email me and just to share your thoughts. And I know it's a Friday, so once again, let me just say I'm very thankful that you guys just took the time to join the webinar to share your experiences. We know that it's a really challenging time. We know finding time is difficult, and so once again, we thank you very much for that. And I just want to say thank you for joining us. We appreciate. There's no questions. I'm not going to hold you, as I all know we could be doing other things. But if you want to follow up with me after this, here's my contact information. And that's it. I thank you once again. Have a good day.